Small problems. User stories have to be estimable and small. And I can tell you from having done this for a while that this is a very difficult battle that I fight as a coach, which is the tendency to make stories bigger than they can be in order to be done. So big stories are hard to understand, bigger things are hard to estimate, and they're hard to bring across the finish line. And we know that we can't really solve a complex problem intrinsically, that anytime we have a complex problem, it has to be broken down to a simpler problem. And then by virtue of solving simpler problems, we then solve complex problems that way. So we know we have to break down complex problems. So we don't try to attack complex user stories. We focus instead on getting them to be small. If you're familiar with the typical baseline estimation that is recommended by SAFE, for example, where we use a Fibonacci scale, larger stories or stories that come in as 5+, they seem to always cause issues when they appear on a sprint plan. And that's because if you're using the pure estimation scheme that's recommended by SAFE, a 5-point story set that takes more than half a sprint to complete. And if that's the case, then the likelihood of you completing that is very, very low if you don't get that story done in the first couple days of a sprint. That's why I recommend, if we use that scheme, we keep actionable stories to ideally 1, 2, 3 if we need to, 4 if we have 2 points when possible. We want to try and get the stories down as small as possible. And the way we do that is by using iterative elaboration. And that allows us to split these stories down and make it more efficient to consume. So let's talk about splitting stories. So how do we split stories? Why we already went through this. They move across the Kanban, easier to test, easier to demo, faster time to QA. We want to minimize the time that QA assets are idle. We want to have testing starting as early in a sprint as possible. And we already talked about, as things change, that shorter stories mean more flexibility when the conditions might change. And if we're planning on an iterative basis, if we're using Scrum or Scrumban, or if we're on a SAFE team and we're working in development iterations, smaller things are easier to organize in an iteration. And there are things like epics and features, that's outside the scope of this talk, but there are things that do have a longer lifespan than a user story, but they have a different rationale and different techniques for splitting. And that's a little out of scope of this talk, but I love to talk about features too. We're just not talking about features today. So what I am advising, and this is I say it's an incomplete list, but I'm going to read these words to you, and I would like you all to kind of think, what makes these words similar? What's interesting about these words? And, both, multiple, different, or, also, many, with, then, various, next, when, separate, similar, like, unlike. All of these words, which I call seam words, these are all words that if you see these words in a user story, there's a good chance that that user story can be split. For example, if I say something like or unlike, that implies that there's two things that I'm comparing. If so, that's an opportunity to split that story on a seam. Or if I talk about mixed, identical, alike, these are all comparative things. Certain is identification. After, before, it might be workflow or some other type of timing. It all implies multiplicity. And that's what we're looking for inside our stories. We're looking for multiplicity that we can take advantage of. And the seam words are the easy way to do that. So let's look at a couple real quick stories here. Oh, here we go. Seam words are a dead giveaway that a story can or needs to be split, and they imply that there's actually multiple value statements within a single one. So we look for the seams and we split on the seams into more achievable stories. We use an iterative elaboration, which we'll go through to do that. And it also works, although a little differently, for bigger value like features, capabilities, epics, and etc. But here's how the seam words basically work. So I could see here's just 8 quickie stories. They're not meant to be meaningful. They're just meant to be an example. And kind of scan through these with your eyes. And I'll just give you just 30 seconds to read through these. Scan with your eyes and see if you can pick out the seam words in these 8 little mini stories here. I'll give you a clue. In the first one, as an admin, I want to change passwords for internal and external users. Well, the and is the obvious seam word. I can deliver value to my internal users and then deliver value to my external users. And I can split that story into 2 stories. So how would we do that for the rest of these stories? I'll just give a couple moments. Take a look then. Okay. And of course we have the answers, okay? And these are the seam words that we're looking for. So if I could say, for example, if I could say as a manager, I can export various reports. Well, various implies multiplicity. I need to figure out what reports and see what I can deliver. What's the least I can deliver? What's my minimal marketable feature? What's my minimum deliverable value? Or same thing here. As a sales user, I can sort results by different sales regions or demographics. Well, if it's different, that means that I can split this into multiple value statements depending on how many sales regions or demographics that I'm looking at. That's when I would start to have these conversations that we're going to talk about of iterative elaboration. As an auditor, I can review the accounts for many kinds of users. Well, that's great, but what kinds of users? Which is the most important kind of user to review activity for? These are questions that we answer in this iterative elaboration. Same thing with the next area, certain sales regions. Well, what do we mean by certain? That's a conversation we have with our product manager and product owners. As a manager, I can show identical views. Well, identical, that implies that there's a comparison. If there's a comparison, there's multiplicity. Right, so how can I restate that in a number? And the same thing with the last two stories. I can take these and I can break them down almost trivially by using these seam words. It's the easiest way to break stories down that there is. We're not going to get into some of the more complex breakdowns that are technical breakdowns, such as modularization. That's a different topic for a different audience. So what do we end up? What are the products of story? What do we do with story splitting? We use spikes. And if everybody should be familiar with spikes, if not, I'll explain them. A spike is a plannable increment of time, a time box that we allocate within a planning horizon, whatever it may be, to understand and split complex, lengthy, or other stories that have this natural multiplicity, that have these seams. We use spikes to take time to make our big stories small. Sometimes we will split a story into a bunch of little stories. Sometimes we will split a story in such a way where we actually change part of the story to an acceptance criterion. Sometimes we'll split a story and part of it will come out of scope. And there's a couple other ways that we can split, but we don't have enough time to talk about that, which is to split by testing requirements. And I'll briefly mention that what that means is if there are certain features that you need to test more or less rigorously, sometimes we will split those stories because the testing becomes a constraint on the delivery of that value. But that's out of scope for this talk. And then we also have modularization, and that's a technical way of splitting. These are more along the lines of architectural or development or design than actual product management and user story maintenance.